Look, it's actually made for me. It's great to be back. Thank you for having me again. Really wonderful uh, precursors. So the music and the meditation, the children's message. I feel like I'm going to be a huge disappointment. So just hang in there. Um, one order of business. Speaking of music, before I get started on the talk, for those of you who were here 2 months ago and were here for my daughter's performance, your very warm and generous response to them was really touched us. I just want to, on behalf of the family, thank you for that. You would think that your warm and generous response would have motivated them to spend more time working on their music and putting more numbers together, etc. You might think that. You would be wrong. So please invite them out here without me next time. Uh, in terms of my own musical participation 2 months ago, I would just like to say that coming up here and speaking about climate change or the climate crisis and the end of life as we know it is far less harrowing than playing the piano in public. So, sorry, that's an inside joke for those of you who are here, but nonetheless. Okay. Where to begin? So the uh, and by the way, in terms of your response, polite, gentle laughter, I know I have a bit of a reputational problem, and that is that people sometimes come up to me after my talks here and they say, "You're funny. Be funny. Keep being funny. Climate change is not funny, all right? So just back off today, all right?" I do have, I don't have a joke, but I do have I have one amusing sign that I saw that I can relate to you as a way to begin this, and that is, was at a climate change protest movement, and there was a young person there with a sign. For those of you who have been involved in activism of any kind, you know the chant, of course, what do we want? Justice. When do we want it? Now, right? We're all familiar with that. The sign said, what do we want? Evidence-based science. When do we want it? After peer review. I thought, great. And so I did, after that, I said, well, they're going to want more jokes than that. That's what they're used to. So I did Google climate change humor or jokes, and apparently the Germans have come up with the most of this. And with all apologies to those of you from German ancestry or my German friends, if the Germans are at the forefront in terms of the humor, I'm just not going to go there. So. Oh, okay. Climate change was not talked about a lot even 3-4 years ago. You do a literature search, do a search of journals, magazines, articles. Much more prevalent in the last few years, and especially in the last 2 years, than prior to that. So what that does, at the very least, is puts the onus on all of this to decide, okay, what are my thoughts and my actions, if any, vis-a-vis the climate issue, crisis, challenge, change. And being raised a good, or in my case, bad Protestant, even though I can't fix climate change, there's enough Calvinism left in me that I want to know who to blame for it. And then, if any of that blame actually comes to me, I want to know how much guilt I should be feeling about that. So I've broken the talk along these lines: global responsibility, local responsibility, personal responsibility, and then I have varying degrees of fault attached to that. It's all very complicated. There's a chart and a graph later that we can hand out. I'll start with global. If you know the history of this at all, you know a little bit about the work of James Hansen and William Nordhaus, and won the Nobel Prize for some of his modeling on this, and some of the early work that came out in the 1970s that did capture people's attentions, including both Democratic and Republican administrations and Congress. There were some front-page New York Times stories about it. A young Al Gore made it a signature issue early on. And there was something called the Charney Report that was issued in the late 70s, and even caught the attention of Exxon. At that point, Exxon, not ExxonMobil. A man named, what was his name? Edward David Jr., who was the director of research for Exxon at the time. They went on record publicly as saying, we buy the science, we've established our own scientific inquiry into this. This is really going to get bad. They saw, along with the scientists, their own scientists saw, many of the effects of climate change that we're beginning to experience now. And they said, we're going to move. We're going to be at the forefront of this. We're going to move to solar. We're going to move to nuclear. We're going to put more effort into engineering away from and to mitigate the effects of climate change. Right? They're on record. They're moving in that direction. Jimmy Carter commissions a study, large study, many scientists. Let's corroborate these findings, get it out there. He loses, you may recall, to a man named Ronald Reagan. The report doesn't get tabled, but it certainly is not encouraged. It finally gets issued in 1983. It says many of the same things that the China report and Exxon's own research shows. It's really bad, and it's going to get worse. And the way it gets spun to the media is by a man named Nuremberg, of all things. And he says, you know, we've innovated our way, America and Americans, out of crises before. We'll innovate our way out of this. Again, don't worry. Don't panic. We'll figure it out. We've got this covered, right? Media backs off. Certain level of activism dies down. And for the last 30 years, right, not a whole lot. Not to diminish anybody's actions, but certainly administratively, politically, not a lot has happened. Really, really too bad, because the economists who've looked at this now recently say, you know what, if we'd made that change 30 years ago, 35 years ago, probably fairly little disruption to the economy. We could have moved to renewables. We could have moved to electric vehicles. We could have moved to, you know, different agricultural practices. We could have done a lot of things. We knew we had the science. A lot of it was corroborated. It could have happened 30 years ago. The transition could have been much smoother than it's going to be, given that we didn't do all those things. That they downplay it, that it gets dropped in the early 1980s, makes it not my fault. So I'll go on record. It's not my fault that the Reagan and other administrations didn't pick this up and do what they should have done. I was young. I was ignorant. I didn't know. It's not my fault. All right. Second thing on a global perspective, as you know, depending on your perspective of politics, either during or after the Reagan administration, the Republican Party got radicalized. And rather than having a number of Republicans willing to compromise and work with Democrats on a whole range of issues, and vice versa, the tagline became "Don't cooperate under any circumstances whatsoever." So I want to go on record too, a really bold statement. The radicalization of the Republican Party as the party of opposition is not my fault. However, it has had dramatic consequences, right? All sorts of things that could have been bipartisan issues that could have moved us along, and again, made the transition that we're going to have to go through far less traumatic, could have been mitigated by them. Why? Well, a number of reasons why it became so radicalized. But some of you may remember an article by a couple of social psychologists not too long ago, because I know you stay up late reading articles by social psychologists, like some of us. And the title was, Republicans Actually Do Believe in Climate Change. Okay? And they do. They, by and large, poll very similarly to Democrats in terms of their acceptance of the science. But let me read you one of the direct quotes from the research they did as to why, even though privately or on anonymous surveys they'll say they agree, they don't actually go along with the program. Bob Inglis, a former Republican congressman from South Carolina, spoke of his opposition in his first to doing anything about climate change in his first several years in Congress. Quote, "All I knew was that Al Gore was for it, therefore I was against it." In one study, we asked Democrats, Republicans, Independents to consider one of two carbon pricing policies, a national cap and trade program and national review neutral carbon tax. We varied the information we gave about political support for the policies, sometimes saying a policy was backed by Democratic members of Congress, sometimes saying it was backed by Republican members. You know where it goes, right? So the tribalism, the digging in your heels in terms of identifying with a particular party and then exacerbating by sticking to your guns even in the face of evidence as a sign of loyalty, a loyalty test, has only gotten worse over the last couple of decades. Here's the one bright note, because we don't want to make this all sort of awful. And the researchers say, here's the bright note that comes out of this, and that is, if you can find, yet again, a reasonable Republican to advance a carbon tax, you did. I mean, some of these ideas I actually had bipartisan and even were generated by Republicans in the 1970s, early 80s. Said, if you can find one now, he said, since the Democrats, people who profile as Democrats or even left Democrats, they are less willing to dig in their heels. They are more open, by way of personality profile, openness to experience. They actually are more willing to go along and compromise on Republican-generated programs. If we can find a Republican who will stand up and advance a reasonable, rational, consequential carbon policy, it's more likely the Democrats will fall in line. We just need a Republican out in front. So if you have one in mind, please call your and make that happen as soon as possible. All right? So that's the global aspect that I'm going to take up in the time I have. Globally, it's not my fault. And it does matter that we're here in this country because, as you know, we still account for more than anybody else in terms of contributions to greenhouse gases and other terrible practices. And it was pointed out this morning when we were talking, we had mentioned it, that China's running a close second, but one of the reasons they're running a close second is because they're making all the crap that we buy. It's still sort of indirectly or directly, I suppose, our fault. So globally, it's not my fault, just in case you were wondering. Locally, all right. So for the past 2.5 years, I've been facilitating a group at Grand Valley through our ethics center. We called it the Climate Advocacy Group, but it came back to me about 1.5 years after I started that it was informally being known as DeWilde's Climate Group, which made me very nervous. It was very strange. But it was a coalition of people brought together from places like Steelcase, the director of sustainability there, and people from Meyer, and a lot of NGOs, the Citizens Climate Lobby. We had lots of different folks in the room, small to large. And 2 reasons they came. They said, one, we can't get all these disparate voices in a room at the same time actually talking about what we want to do. We haven't been able to work that out. Grand Valley is more or less a neutral spot. We can do it here, and you can facilitate that, so I have. And 2, said we're frustrated with the lack of movement within our companies, within the community, with politics, and could you help us with that? The first one I could help them with. The second one, we put on some conferences, we did some lovely things. It hasn't morphed or evolved quite as strongly as I hoped it would, but here's the direction it's going. And by the way, before I tell you where it's going, a number of the directors of sustainability from various large companies, I mentioned Steelcase, there were others there as well. You should probably just know this if you don't, and that is they would love to use the phrase climate change, climate crisis. They are being advised by their legal teams and by their marketing teams, even now, not to use that phrase publicly. To not say it out loud, that they've got to couch it in other language. The woman from Steelcase is terrific. She's pushing very hard. She thinks that they'll be allowed, that she's making the case, and that'll happen sooner rather than later. But even at this date, they don't let them say it. You can fill in the blanks, right, in terms of how that might scare people away and why they don't want to do that, investors in particular. And yet, the odd thing is, every single company I work with or talk to, small, medium, or large, has or is developing a contingency climate change plan because, if not all, many of them at this point are already being squeezed along supply chain lines. How they get their materials, where they get it from, the amount of the material itself, all of that is changing because of climate change. They know it, right? And it's happening. So where it's happening is that Allison Sutter, who's the Program and Sustainability Manager for the City of Grand Rapids, and has been actively involved in this group at Grand Valley, said, we do have to do more. The City of Grand Rapids had a reputation as a leading green city in the country. We want to get that back. And how about if we bring all the active parties together, people are working on this, small, large, business, NGOs, etc., not-for-profits. We'll get them in a room under the umbrella of the city, and the city will be, because we've got the connections, again, more or less neutral spot, we can make this happen. So they're rolling that out at the end of July, and I'll be part of that. But as part of that, I have to tell you this as well, I was brought into a room where there were 6 of us representing different, fairly large or considered to be influential organizations in Grand Rapids, and let's all work on this together. Let's all, agree to pool our efforts, work in concert more. Nobody owns climate change, right? Well, that's a nice thought, but I'm in a position where I don't have to scramble for money, right? Grand Valley's doing pretty well, and I don't have to go out and write a lot of grants to support myself. That wasn't the case for many of the other people in the room who have made a job out of climate change. And so there was a lot of resistance, I would say, gentle resistance, and some then long-term passive-aggressive reluctance to be part of this and join because nobody wants to give up what is a short-term self-interest, which is my job as director of coalition of that or organization for this. In this morning's conversation, we're talking about that, the short-term self-interest of people who are profiting off of climate change, the melting of the Arctic, for example, and the access to minerals. We don't want to, or we will, we see an opportunity to profit off of that. And those of us, the good people, right, who are working to mitigate it or adapt to it, as, I don't know your name, but you pointed out, said, well, why don't we probably need to check ourselves at some point, and in what ways are we still invested, even as the people in charge of various do-gooder organizations, in perpetuating the problem so that we continue to write grants and get grants. So we're going to roll this out. I'm on board. I've sort of publicly stated my commitment to it. People know me in this space, so I'm in Grand Rapids. So if it doesn't work out, if we don't do anything of any consequence in the next couple of years, that will be partly my fault. Okay? So you see where I'm going? It's not my fault. It's partly my fault. Now the personal. I'm loath to go to the personal because you know where I'm going. Okay, I got to preface this, the personal part, a little bit with reference to Dan Ariely, the behavioral economist, tremendously influential, the guy who wrote Predictably Irrational, a lot of other books. His latest book is on cheating. And a number of points in there, but one of them is most of us cheat, lie, even steal a little bit on a regular basis, but we do it in such small margins, in so much small ways, that it's very easy for us to rationalize that we're still good people. And we are still good people. We take a few things from the office without mentioning it to anybody. We tell a few lies here and there to smooth things over. We do lots of things like that. But we're still good people, right? He says the problem with that is that you're not good people. The problem with that is if the cumulative effect of lots of good people doing very small, marginally bad things is greater than the handful of really bad folks doing obviously terrible things. And he's got a whole book on that I recommend to you, right? But the background for that is, all right, the rationalization of my personal behavior. And he goes on to say, you know what? He's got bankers in mind because I think he thinks bankers are maybe the worst example of the lot. And some of you who are lapsed Catholics who found your way to C3 are not going to like this, but he said, you know what? He said, maybe the Catholic Church actually was onto something. If you do either big bad things like bankers or small bad things like me, there has to be some place away from religion, a kind of civic religious spot, somehow, within a company or other, to confess. Confession actually is a good thing. I'm really sorry. Do you forgive me? Yes, we forgive you. You know? Or, no, we don't forgive you and you are going to hell, right? In my tradition. But some place to kind of come clean without going to prison, all right? So in the spirit of confession, here we go. And Thich Nhat Hanh's prayer. Dear Mother Earth, please forgive me, for I have sinned. I still use single-use plastic items from time to time because the thing within that single-use plastic item looks so damn good to me that I can't resist it. And I do take it home, And I do use it, and I do pretend that I'm going to recycle it by putting it in a recycle bin, even though I know a lot of that stuff ends up in landfills anyway. So, confession number one. Confession number two, my diet. And a lot of the young people I work with are pretty passionate about this, and I really admire them for that. Please forgive me, I've sinned. I still do stop at Five Guys occasionally. Uh, I occasionally do look for a steak that's done, medium rare, that's seasoned just right. There are a number of things along the lines of diet that I could change that I have not. And let me go to the one, and I'll extend this one a little bit and get into it. Mother Earth, you have to forgive me. I continue to travel on a regular basis for my work, and have yet to put the solar panels on the south-facing exposure of my roof, which I've been told. I had the consultant come out. He looked at it. Cost me about $6,000, which, I mean, we're doing all right, but I do have 2 young daughters, so it's not like every penny doesn't count, right? So we could do it, and even though the return on investment is probably longer than we'll have the house, it does, according to him, it'll cut the energy cost by about 40% within the first year of use. The wall batteries have evolved to a point where that's doable. Do I do that now? $6,000 into that right now? Or my daughters are huge fans of ancient history and read a lot and study Latin, and they want to go to Greece and Rome, and we have friends in France. And next summer I've got a little time. It would probably cost us about $8,000 to do that in the way that I like to do that. All right? Okay, what's the carbon footprint of an airplane trip? New York to LA, the carbon expenditure is about 90 square feet, about the same size as a pickup truck. Think about a pickup-sized truck piece of Arctic ice melting into the ocean, raising sea levels, right? And I'm not going to go to California, even though I do go there too. In the next year, I've got California, Vietnam, and potentially Europe. Large carbon footprint. So the way the woman in the New York Times who wrote about this, we love the world, we love to travel. It enriches our lives, it opens perspectives. We meet other people and think they speak strange things and eat wonderful things. And how can we have more of that in our lives? And I want that for my daughter, right? I love them. You could argue, I love them enough to spend the $6,000 to cut the energy consumption so that another pickup-sized piece of ice doesn't fall into the ocean, or I love them enough to show them the world that they will then treasure and value even more than they do now, and work even harder in the future to convince their father not to fly around the world like this. You see the conundrum, right? The dilemma. I love the earth, I love my children, I love the earth so much I want them to see as much of it as possible. I love the earth so much I should just stay in my home, put the solar panels on, and try to convince the neighbors to do the same. Back and forth we go. How to decide? Well, lots of different ways, but in the Times article and many other articles, because this bothers me, and as the ethics guy at the Seaman College of Business, occasionally I am bothered by the notion that what I do publicly might actually reflect on my position. Do think about that occasionally. It's like, oh, the ethics guy. I saw the ethics guy smoking dope and like burning coal the other day. I was like, oh, yeah, 1 out of 2 ain't bad, I guess, so anyway, so what to do? So the way out right now, that the consensus of the people who also feel their conscience pricked by this particular dilemma is, of course, the carbon offset route, right? Delta and United both offer that. It's not easy to find on their websites. It's like they don't quite want you to, but you can find it. And you can overcompensate, right? You can buy all kinds of methane offset. You can plant trees. There are a number of organizations you can go to that will offset that. We're going to go to California with the whole family, so we'll plant 25 trees. It'll cost me another $1,000, but it'll be worth it for salve our conscience and not to look in my daughter's faces, as the earth burns around us. That's one way to do it. Best best way everybody says, stop, just stop. All right. United has gone to about 18% biofuel in their fleets, but not all of the planes are fitted for that yet. Technology is going to be a while before that advances, before that happens. Here's what I think, quite honestly, since I'm confessing, is going to happen. I am going to take them, and I'm going to take them to Europe too, and I'm going to go into a little bit of debt to put the solar panels on. I want to have my cake and eat it too, along with the offsets. Right? I want to enjoy the world in the few precious years I have left. I love beauty. I love my daughters. I want them to appreciate some. It's selfish. I don't pretend it's not. Here's what, in the face of that, and because I think I'm more or less typical in that regard, and because among people of means who have these kinds of choices to make, I think I'm not atypical either. Here's what I would like to see happen, and this comes from an older piece that really catches me up short every time I read it, by a social psychologist and an economist called Can Selfishness Save the World? And that is, I know in my case what I need is not like a website that publicly shames me. I don't need the equivalent of a Fitbit that tells me what my carbon footprint is. What I need is the United States government, not Grand Rapids, not the state of Michigan. I need the United States government in all three branches to say, this really is an existential threat. This really is the only and most important and significant issue. All other activism, all of your other ethical deliberations, everything else you think is so important, pales in comparison to what you're doing, your thoughts, your actions. And I chose the Bill McKibben readings because he's really good on going back and forth between the personal and the political. Those of you from the 70s remember, right? Personal is the political. Never has that been truer than climate change, I think. And that is, no, we need policy issues. We need policy change, of course. McKibben writes, yes, but the policy change will come from us deliberating, thinking about, reflecting upon every single daily action. We don't use plastic straws anymore, and we decline them when we go into a restaurant. Are we virtuous? No. We're starting to shift towards, as Aristotle would say, a practice habituating ourselves to thinking and acting along lines that would internalize the feeling of how sick it should make me for us to use a single item, a piece of plastic, right? I know I need help with that. I know I need to be nudged by others in doing that. I want the United States government, sooner rather than later, to tell me if I don't do that, the punishment, the taxation, the public approbation, the jail time, something will be so large that no matter my political class or leanings, no matter my socioeconomic class, I will think twice, 3 times, 4 times before deciding to do the right thing and actually doing it. It seems like enough, doesn't it? It's almost 11 o'clock. If there's more, I suppose we could talk about it later. As always, thanks for having me.